Everything you've been taught about ancient engineering is a lie. They told you Rome invented the aqueducts. They told you Rome tamed the rivers. They didn't. Rome stole the blueprint. 300 years before a Roman engineer ever laid a single water pipe, an ancient king in the Middle East forced a 30-mile river through a scorching, jagged mountain range. And he didn't just use gravity. He used a boiling, toxic chemical sludge to waterproof the stone, and massive bronze machines that history books swear weren't invented for another 400 years. Rome took the credit, but the original impossible hydrotech is still sitting in the Iraqi desert today. To understand this engineering marvel, you first have to understand the man who demanded it. The year is 700 BC. On the throne sits Sennacherib, king of Assyria, a name soaked in fear and legend. This is the ruler who crushed Lachish, who besieged Jerusalem, who caged Hezekiah like prey. His empire didn't just conquer, it terrorized. But brutality wasn't his only obsession. Sennacherib was driven by something deeper: envy. He despised Babylon, the shining jewel of culture and religion, and he was determined to outdo it. So he chose Nineveh as his stage. There he began building what he boldly called the palace without rival. Massive walls stretching miles, giant stone bowls weighing tens of tons, lush elevated gardens filled with exotic life from across the world. But there was a problem, one that threatened to destroy the dream: water. Nineveh sat beside the Tigris River, but it was useless. Wild floods in spring, weak trickles in summer, and worst of all, it flowed below the city's grand terraces. No steady flow, no pressure, no life for the gardens. Sennacherib didn't accept limits. If the water wouldn't come to Nineveh, he would drag it there. From the distant Zagros Mountains, over 30 miles away, across valleys and desert heat, he envisioned something impossible: an artificial river in the sky. When we talk about the Assyrian aqueduct system, we are not talking about a simple ditch dug in the dirt. We are looking at a masterclass in ancient physics. The crown jewel of this entire network is a structure known today as the Jagged Aqueduct. Imagine standing in a dry, wide valley. Suddenly, an artificial mountain of dressed limestone cuts directly across your path. The Jagged Aqueduct spanned over 900 feet across the valley floor and stood almost 30 feet high. It was constructed using an estimated 2 million dressed limestone blocks. Let's do the math on that. 2 million blocks. Each block had to be quarried, shaped with iron chisels, transported across the desert, and lifted into place. There were no cranes. There were no diesel engines. Just human muscle, leverage, and the sweat of thousands of prisoners of war. But the sheer volume of stone isn't the part that keeps modern civil engineers awake at night. The true impossibility of Jagged lies in its mathematical gradient. If you want water to flow continuously over 30 miles without the use of electrical pumps, you have to rely entirely on gravity. But if the slope is too steep, the water gains kinetic energy. It moves too fast, creating extreme friction and hydraulic pressure that will eventually tear the stone channels apart. If the slope is too flat, the water stalls, sediment builds up, algae chokes the channel, and the water stops flowing. To make this work, the Assyrian surveyors had to calculate a microscopic drop in elevation. The channel dropped precisely 1 millimeter for every single meter of distance. Think about the precision required for that. Over 30 miles of hills, valleys, and uneven desert floor, they maintained a consistent millimeter-perfect slope. They had no laser levels. They had no satellite topography. They used nothing but primitive water levels, plumb bobs, sighting rods, and a terrifyingly high standard of mathematical geometry. But perfect math doesn't stop water from seeping through the cracks between the 2 million stones. Limestone is porous. Water finds the weakness in every joint. If you run a massive artificial river over a dry stone bridge, the bridge will eventually leak, weaken, and collapse. So how did the Assyrians seal a 30-mile stone pipeline? They didn't have modern silicone. They didn't have rubber gaskets. They turned to a primitive, highly combustible chemical found naturally bubbling up from the ground in Mesopotamia. They used bitumen. Bitumen is a naturally occurring, viscous, pitch-black asphalt. It smells like sulfur and burning earth. The Assyrian workers would heat this thick sludge in massive bronze cauldrons over roaring fires until it turned into a boiling, sticky liquid. They would then pour the molten bitumen over the floor of the aqueduct, creating a thick, impenetrable, waterproof membrane across the entire 30-mile stretch. They essentially paved the bottom of their artificial river with ancient asphalt. 3 millennia before modern contractors used bitumen to waterproof skyscraper foundations, Sennacherib's engineers were using it to defy the desert. The water flowed perfectly, clean, cold mountain spring water rushing into the heart of Nineveh. But once the water reached the city, Sennacherib faced his next impossible hurdle. How do you get that water up into the hanging? Every student of history knows the 7 wonders of the ancient world: the Great Pyramid, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and of course, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story goes that King Nebuchadnezzar II built the magnificent elevated gardens in Babylon to cure his foreign wife's homesickness for the green mountains of her youth. It is a beautiful story. It is also, almost certainly, completely wrong. For over a century, the greatest archaeologists in the world have taken picks and shovels to the ruins of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. They have mapped the palaces, they have mapped the streets, they have found the massive Ishtar Gate. But in over 100 years of obsessive digging, they have found absolutely zero archaeological evidence of the Hanging Gardens. Not a single foundation, not a single specialized water pipe. Furthermore, in the tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar boasts about everything he built: his walls, his temples, his streets. He never mentions a garden, not once. How does a wonder of the world simply vanish without leaving a single stone or a single receipt? It didn't vanish. We've just been looking in the wrong city for 2,000 years. Dr. Stephanie Daly, an Assyriologist from Oxford University, broke this forensic cold case wide open. Through a meticulous retranslation of ancient texts, she proposed a revolutionary correction. The Hanging Gardens were never in Babylon. They were in Nineveh. They were Sennacherib's palace without rival. The confusion stems from the fact that ancient writers often confused Nineveh and Babylon, as Assyria had conquered Babylon and Nineveh was frequently referred to as New Babylon. When you look at Nineveh, the evidence is overwhelming. Sennacherib's own cuneiform tablets boast extensively about his massive, elevated botanical gardens. He details the specific trees he imported. He details the exact terraces. But to make an elevated garden survive in the desert, you need to lift thousands of gallons of water vertically every single day. Gravity brought the water to Nineveh, but gravity won't push water up a 50-foot terrace. The Greeks claimed that the mechanism used to raise water in the ancient world was the Archimedes screw, a massive corkscrew-like blade inside a hollow cylinder. When the bottom is placed in water and the screw is turned, it traps the water and drags it upward against gravity. History books explicitly state this device was invented by the Greek genius Archimedes around 250 BC. But Dr. Daly found a cuneiform tablet of Sennacherib's that completely rewrites the timeline of human technology. In the text, Sennacherib describes his gardens and details a bronze mechanical device he invented to water them. He describes creating a mold of clay, pouring in molten bronze, and casting massive water screws and cylinders to draw the water up. Read that again: massive bronze water screws. Sennacherib's engineers were casting industrial-scale bronze Archimedes screws nearly 300 years before Archimedes was even born. Think about the metallurgical nightmare of casting a solid bronze screw that large in 700 BC. They had to dig massive pits in the earth, pack them with specific mixtures of clay and straw, carve the complex internal helix of the screw perfectly in reverse, and then pour thousands of pounds of 2,000-degree molten bronze into the mold without the metal cooling too fast, cracking, or introducing air bubbles. It was a staggering achievement of heavy industry, and it ran 24 hours a day, lifting the water from the Jerwan aqueduct into the sky, creating a lush green mountain in the middle of a brown desert. Nineveh wasn't just a military superpower, it was the Silicon Valley of ancient hydro engineering. When you build something this impossible, you want the world to know. But Sennacherib's ego went far beyond simple bragging. If you walk along the dry bed of the Jerwan Aqueduct today, you will find massive panels of cuneiform text carved directly into the limestone blocks. The inscriptions boast of the king's brilliance, his reach, and his power. But here is the psychological anomaly. These massive, highly detailed carvings were placed inside the water channel. Once the aqueduct was turned on, millions of gallons of rushing water covered the text. No human being could read them. No visiting dignitary could see them. The greatest technological boast of the Assyrian Empire was intentionally hidden underwater. Why do you carve a monument that no one can see? Because Sennacherib wasn't writing to men. He was writing a contract with the gods of nature. In the ancient mind, water was chaotic. Rivers were deities. To force a river to leave its natural bed and travel 30 miles through a stone box was an act of profound hubris. It was a violation of the natural order. Sennacherib carved his name into the channel to establish permanent, divine dominion over the water itself. The water would literally flow over his name day after day, year after year, forced into submission by his decree. Listen to the actual translation of the text carved into the Jerwan stones. Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria. Over a great distance I had a watercourse directed to the environs of Nineveh, joining together the waters. Over deep-cut ravines I spanned a bridge of white stone blocks. Those waters I caused to pass over upon it. But he didn't just stop at boasting. He understood the vulnerability of his system. A 30-mile aqueduct is completely exposed. An enemy army doesn't have to attack the city walls. They just have to break the stone channel 30 miles away, and the city dies of thirst. So, alongside his boasts, Sennacherib carved brutal psychological warfare. He engraved terrifying curses into the stone, promising absolute divine wrath upon anyone who dared to alter, damage, or divert his water system. He cursed their bloodlines, their crops, and their eternal souls. He believed his math, his bronze, and his curses had made Nineveh invincible. He was catastrophically wrong. The very water he tamed was about to be turned. By 612 BC, Sennacherib was dead, assassinated by his own sons. The Assyrian Empire, bloated on centuries of violence and plunder, had made too many enemies. An allied coalition of Babylonians and Medes marched on Nineveh. They wanted blood. They wanted revenge for centuries of Assyrian terror. But when they arrived, they faced an architectural nightmare. The walls of Nineveh were 100 feet tall and 50 feet thick. You could drive 3 chariots side by side along the top of the ramparts. Battering rams simply bounced off. Siege towers were burned. For 3 long months, the Allied armies sat outside the city, completely unable to break the perimeter. But the Babylonians didn't need to break the walls. They just needed to look at the water. The invading armies realized that Sennacherib's genius was also Nineveh's fatal flaw. The city was completely dependent on the Hasa River and the massive aqueduct system that fed directly through the city walls to power the gardens and fill the moats. If you can control the water, you can control the city. The biblical prophet Nahum, who accurately predicted the fall of Nineveh in shocking detail, wrote this specific, terrifying line. The river gates are thrown open and the palace collapses. Nahum 2, verse 6. For centuries, scholars thought this was just poetic imagery, but forensic hydrology tells a very different story. The Babylonians and Medes moved upstream. They didn't poison the water, they dammed it. Using earth, timber, and stone, they choked off the Hassa River and the aqueduct channels, causing a massive artificial reservoir to build up in the valley above the city. Inside Nineveh, the water stopped flowing. The hanging gardens began to wither, the moats began to drop. But the Assyrians were secure behind their 100-foot walls. They didn't realize they weren't facing a drought, they were facing a bomb. Once the upstream pressure reached a critical mass, millions of tons of pent-up kinetic energy pressing against the makeshift dams, the Allied armies broke the dams. The release was apocalyptic. A localized tsunami of brown water, mud, and debris roared down the valley, accelerating as it hit the engineered slope of the aqueduct system. When that wall of water slammed into the river gates of Nineveh, the kinetic force was incalculable. The massive limestone walls of the city were virtually indestructible to iron battering rams, but they were not designed to withstand the hydrostatic pressure of a flash flood. The water undermined the foundations, the earth turned to mud, the 50-foot thick walls began to groan, shift, and then catastrophically buckle. A massive section of the impregnable wall collapsed into the roaring water, leaving a gaping hole in the city's defenses. The Babylonian and Median armies didn't even have to climb. They simply walked over the mud and the ruined limestone into the heart of the Assyrian Empire. They slaughtered the defenders, burned the palace without rival to the ground, and erased the Silicon Valley of the ancient world in a matter of days. The water that built the empire was the exact weapon used to unmake it. Today, in the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq, the remains still stand, weathered, half-buried, but unbroken. At Jerewan Aqueduct, the stones still lock together with impossible precision. Black traces of bitumen cling to the limestone, 2,700 years old and still holding on. Step into the dry channel and you'll find something even more powerful, a message carved in stone. Sennacherib, King of the world, I built a bridge of white stone. History gives the spotlight to Rome, but long before Roman aqueducts, Sennacherib had already mastered gravity, engineered long-distance water systems, and built something the world still struggles to fully understand. The truth isn't in textbooks. It's buried in the sands of Iraq. And Jerewan leaves us with a warning. Water builds empires, but the moment you lose control, it destroys them. So the question is, how much of what we call Roman innovation was actually inherited from forgotten empires? Because this story, it's only the beginning.